Maybe you watched the reality TV show The Simple Life when it came out many years ago. The show was a fish out of water program in which two wealthy spoiled brats, Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie, leave behind their lifestyle of the rich and famous and move in with the Letting family in Altus, Arkansas. Now, while there, they are forced to adjust to a new standard of living, a new pace of life. This included such crazy notions as preparing their own food, having a job, and getting up early to go to work. Now, the show was a hit and went on for another 4 seasons. It also spawned spin-offs around the world. Apparently, every country has rich debutantes that their fellow citizens enjoy laughing at. Lest we judge, though, I think it's important to remember that we have a tendency to criticize behaviors and attitudes that we do not like in ourselves. And it's not just rich blonde celebrity princesses with rich daddies who have a hard time working hard and keeping things simple. Many of us struggle in that way. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning, the simple life. The simple life is the humble, unassuming life of hard work, the sort of life that your grandma or your grandpa might have lived on the farm. And I want to talk to you about it because in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul tells us that for the good of our souls, for the sake of our church, and for our very witness to the community, the simple life has much to commend to it, no matter how much we might resist it in our lazy, freeloading, attention-seeking world. First, though, let me fill you in. If you're just joining us, we've been studying Paul's letters to the Thessalonians in our current series called More and More. Paul was a Christian missionary. He was a witness to the resurrected Christ, and he traveled around the Roman Empire, visiting synagogues and starting churches, preaching the good news of God's love for all the people, Jew and Gentile alike. And one of the first churches that Paul ever started was in the beautiful seaside village of Thessaloniki, or Thessalonica. Now, we've talked about this. Paul actually got kicked out of the city because he was a little bit too successful in his gospel preaching efforts. The seed of faith that he planted in Thessalonica had taken root, though, and Paul writes these letters in the New Testament to cultivate their faith and give them some instruction and some encouragement. And he prays that God might do more and more in and through their little congregation. And we're studying Paul's letters to the Thessalonians because that is our prayer for God's work here at Rooftop, that he might do more and more through our little church. Now, I made sure that Pastor Jeremy had the hard passage last week about sexual purity. And I made sure that I had the easy one this week about the simple life. But I think we can all agree that the simple life is not so easy, and it's certainly not as fun as sexual immorality. So this, I think, is a far more difficult sermon. But I will let you be the judge of that. Let me go ahead and read our passage to you for the morning. It comes from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 9 through 12. Now, about your love for one another, we do not need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia. Yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more, and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business and work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders, and so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Now, just to put this passage in context, these verses come from the practical matters portion of Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. Already in the letter, Paul has blessed the Thessalonians, he's prayed for the Thessalonians, he's encouraged the Thessalonians. Eventually, though, he gets down to business. In chapter 4, he begins addressing other matters that he knows his congregation is dealing with. The first of these is sexual immorality, which, like I said, we discussed last week. Christians are humans. Humans have sex. This is good, but God designed this to happen in a way that is good for us and good for each other. Now, the next practical matter that Paul addresses is that of hard work. Now, we don't know if the Thessalonians were particularly challenged in the way of sexual immorality. But we do know that the Thessalonians, or at least some of them, along with Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie, had a problem with hard work. This theme of hard work actually appears a couple times in Paul's letter. Skipping ahead a bit to chapter 5, Paul writes in his farewell, "Now we ask you, brothers and sisters, to acknowledge those who work hard among you. Hold them in the highest regard and love because of their work, and warn those who are idle and disruptive." So it seems to be the case that the church in Thessalonica had some idlers, some freeloaders who weren't pulling their own weight. They weren't working hard or at all. Maybe they had even grown dependent upon the congregation for support. Now, how? How would this happen? Well, what many Bible scholars theorize is that Paul had done such a good job persuading the congregation in Thessalonica of the imminent arrival of Jesus that some congregants decided just to sit around and wait for heaven to arrive instead of working hard to provide for themselves and their families. So they believed that the arrival of Jesus would be happening so darn soon that you might as well not even go to work. And there's some certain logic to this, right? If you look up in the sky and you see a comet heading straight for Earth, are you going to want to go clock in? Not unless you're on the comet team. If you're on the comet team, you got to make sure you go to work that morning. But otherwise, you're probably just going to stay home and think about other things. Now, we should believe that Jesus is returning, right? That's what it means to be a Christian, to believe that Jesus is returning. And hopefully he is returning soon. But that doesn't mean that we don't got to go to work in the morning. Some people in Thessalonica actually thought that. In fact, you can actually see Paul's concern for this problem grow through his correspondence. So the Thessalonians apparently don't do a very good job heeding Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians about the importance of hard work. So he returns to the theme in his second letter, and in his second letter, you can tell that he dials it up. Here's what he writes in 2 Thessalonians. We hear that some among you are still idle and disruptive. They are not busy, they are busybodies. Such people we command and urge in the Lord Jesus Christ to settle down and earn the food they eat. Earn the food you eat. So idleness was apparently a problem. Laziness, freeloading, and according to Paul, it's just not glorifying to God. It's not good for our souls, and it's not very loving. Which brings us back to our passage. Let's go ahead and dig into the passage that I read to you a moment ago to see what God has to say to us this morning about the simple life. I'm going to break up our passage this morning into, of course, 3 sections brought to you by the letter E and by the suffix shun. So in verses 9 and 10a, Paul issues an expectation. In verses 10b through 11, Paul offers an elaboration. And in verse 12, Paul gives us an explanation. So first, Paul's expectation. In verses 9 and 10a, he writes this. He says, "Now about your love for one another, we do not need to write you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. And in fact, you do love all of God's family throughout Macedonia, yet we urge you, brothers and sisters, to do so more and more." So Paul is well aware that the command to love one another is fairly foundational when it comes to Christianity. Maybe even the defining mark of what it means to be a Christian. Jesus, for his part, summarized the entire divine law with 2 commands, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Paul starts on a positive note here, commending them for doing this, for loving one another. We don't even need to write to you about your love for each other, he says. You're doing it. God has taught you how to do it. You're encouraging one another. You're supporting one another. You're loving one another. Good job. 2 thumbs up. The entire Macedonian region has apparently heard about your love. Now, I don't want to get too technical, but, what would a rooftop sermon be without a technicality? The Greek word that Paul uses here for love is a word that many of you might actually recognize. It's the Greek word phileo. Turn to your neighbor and say phileo. Very good. So maybe you know that we English speakers have one word in English for the word love. What is it? That's right, it's love. That's the easiest question that any preacher will ever ask you on Sunday morning. And for the record, most of you sat there like dummies. Good job. We have one word in English for love, and it's the word love. In Greek, they actually have, count them, 4 words for love, and they each sort of describe a different kind of love. And phileo was the word used to refer to love among family. Maybe you know that this is why the founders of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, named their city Philadelphia. Right, I'm still offering easy questions for you. The founders of that city, the founders of the city of Philadelphia were Quakers, a very devoted Christian denomination that views Christians as siblings. So the Quakers wanted their Christian city to be the city of brotherly love, where everybody treated each other as brothers and sisters. Now, I have been to Philadelphia. I don't think they've read Paul's letter. Philadelphia sports fans are consistently rated as the loudest, rudest, and most violent fans on the planet. They could use a little biblical instruction. Ben Franklin and William Penn would be horrified by the hypocrisy. And what's interesting here, though, is that as far as we know, Paul and the Christians were the first to use this word, phileo, brotherly love, in a way that applied to non-siblings. So Paul could have used another word for love to describe how Christians should love each other, but he intentionally chose phileo because he wanted to make a point. What's the point? That we should love each other as family. That's what he says. You do love all of God's family, brothers and sisters. Now, I know that this metaphor of loving one another like family doesn't necessarily work for all of us. You know, our families drive us crazy, right? It's hard to love them. But this is the point. Deep down, I think we know that we should. I mean, you might not love your sister, but in that place, like deep inside your soul, you know, but I have to. Paul's point is that we are sitting next to those people. This church is not, whatever it might seem like, a collection of strangers who just happen to be reciting the same words from the screen. This church, Rooftop, any church, it's a family gathering of siblings bound together by the family blood of our big brother. The Thessalonians seem to get this. Paul commends them for it. All of Macedonia has heard of their love for each other. And I should say that as far as I can tell, the people of Rooftop seem to get this too. All of Afton, not all of Macedonia, but all of Afton has heard about our love for each other and our love for God. They know, our community knows that Rooftop is a family. They know that we love each other. Or at least we know we should. So that's Paul's expectation. Love each other as a family, as you are in fact doing. This doesn't mean that they don't have more to grow in their love, though. Which is why in verse 10b through 11, Paul offers an elaboration. What does it look like to love each other? What should they be doing more and more of? Well, here's where I think the passage takes a really interesting turn. We should love each other by minding our own business. Here's what Paul writes. Yeah, we urge you, brothers and sisters, to love each other more and more and to make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business. Work with your hands, just as we told you. This got interesting. Love each other by minding your own business. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. Be ambitious to be quiet. Make that your goal. Keep to yourself. Keep your head down. Work with your hands. Keep quiet. Clock in. Go get the cows. How does Paul get from, you're doing a great job loving each other, to mind your own business? Well, remember that we know from other parts of the letter that there were some in the Thessalonian church who were being lazy and idle. For some reason, they weren't working very hard. Maybe they were lazy or waiting for Jesus to return, or both. Not all of them, of course, but some just weren't carrying their own weight. In psychological terms, some of them were over-functioning while others of them were under-functioning. Are you aware of these terms? This is a very common relational dynamic. Somehow in a relationship, sometimes in a relationship, one person can sometimes work too hard and the other person can take advantage of the hard work of the other and sit around playing video games all day. Are you aware of this? This makes the overworker have to work even harder, which incentivizes the underworker to work even less. Do you know this dynamic? Are you married to this dynamic? If you are, don't look at your spouse right now. Stare straight ahead. You can talk about it later or keep ignoring the problem, whatever you want to do. Anyway, apparently this was happening in Thessalonica. Some were doing a great job loving one another, over-functioning, but others were taking advantage of all the love and not contributing to the cause, under-functioning. Maybe they weren't working, maybe they were depending on church benevolence too much, maybe they weren't giving or tithing, but were enjoying the services of the hardworking church staff. Maybe they weren't serving, they were just coming to church, eating their bagels, drinking their coffee, and going home. Honestly, sounds like a few Christians I know. They were spiritual and economic freeloaders. Now, I don't want to punch too hard, but I think there are a lot of spiritual and economic freeloaders in the American church today. Consumers who benefit from the work of God, but aren't necessarily a part of it. Paul's point is, that's just not very loving. It's not loving to make other people work harder so that you can work less. This is true whether we're talking about relationships, it's true whether we're talking about marriage, it's true whether we're talking about church, it's true whether we're talking about society. Now, I know this is a sensitive topic, and I admit that it's very complicated. It's complicated for lots of reasons, one of which is not everybody can work as hard as everybody else. I get it. I know that political illustrations can be risky, but if I may, this was at issue in the recent debt ceiling negotiations. I don't know if you've been following the debt ceiling negotiations, but in order to raise the debt ceiling, how much money our nation could borrow, Republicans actually wanted stiffer work requirements for those receiving government aid. And Democrats said, well, those work requirements aren't really that effective, and not everybody can work anyway. So, classic impasse. Once again, everybody's kind of right. Everybody should contribute, but not everybody can. But back to the topic, I'm not talking about politics, neither is Paul. We're talking about the church. You can't love each other as a family by depending on one another without making your fair contribution. Now, yes, there are caveats, right? People go through hard times. This is why we have a benevolence fund here at Rooftop to help people in need. And people should care for people who cannot care for themselves, the elderly, the disabled. Having said that, I've known plenty of elderly and disabled people who have tons of initiative. But even with those exceptions, if you're able to provide for yourself, if you're able to work with your hands or your mind, you should. And it's not just wrong not to, but this is Paul's point, it violates the second most important thing that Jesus gives his people to do. Love one another. It's just not loving to mooch. Off your church, off your spouse, off your government. That's Paul's elaboration on his expectation. Finally, he concludes with an explanation. His expectation is that we love one another. His elaboration is that we should love one another by working hard to provide for ourselves so that we can be generous with others. And then in verses 11 through 12, he gives an explanation. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. You should mind your own business, work with your hands, just as we told you, so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. And so that you will not be dependent on anybody. So Paul gives us two reasons that God's people should work hard at their own business. Let's start with the second one. He says, so that you will not be dependent on anybody. Now, we've already talked about this, but what Paul is warning against here is unhealthy and persistent dependence. I mean, we're all highly dependent on other people, right? All the time. All of us need so many other people in our lives. We depend on the government to provide roads and schools. We depend on the church for fellowship and teaching. I depend on my mechanic to fix my car. I depend on my children to shovel coal in the basement. I'm joking. That's not what I'm having them do down there. We're allowed to depend on others, especially in hard times. The problem is when we get stuck there. The problem is when we get stuck on the assistance of others and we lose the incentive to discover how God can help us provide for ourselves. This is God's will for our lives. God has given us skills and passions and abilities to be able to take care of ourselves so that we can pass it on to others. We talked about this very thing at our deacon meeting a few weeks ago. Our deacons are that group of leaders here at Rooftop that lead our ministries and our small groups. And we discussed at our deacon meeting this book, When Helping Hurts. It's written by Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert, a missionary and a community activist. Corbett and Fickert realized in their work that a lot of what they were doing on behalf of the poor actually wasn't helping the poor. They began to be honest with themselves that most of their efforts to serve the poor were more designed to give themselves a quick fix so that they could feel helpful. In fact, they admitted that a lot of their efforts on behalf of the poor were actually increasing the poor's dependence on their services, not reducing it. So Corbett and Fickert recalibrated their efforts and asked themselves how they can serve the poor, how they can serve the homeless, how they can serve the hungry in a way that helps them help themselves. And this was our discussion at our deacon meeting. And it needs to be a conversation that we're not afraid to have with each other here at Rooftop, because we're all going to need one another in many kinds of ways. But we need to ask ourselves, yes, I can help you in this way, but is that really helping you? Sure, we can help you with your groceries. And we will. But let's have a conversation about budgeting. Sure, we can provide teaching to you, and we will. But how can we help you teach yourselves? I mean, sometimes the most loving thing that you can do someone is to not help them. Sometimes that's the only way they might decide to help themselves. And by helping them when they can help themselves, are we even really loving them? And if we're not loving them, what are we doing? Are we hating them? Hating them by not believing in them and that they can and should learn to care for themselves. But the other reason that Paul says we should love one another by minding our own business is so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. That's what he says. Paul's very concerned about the reputation of this young church in Thessalonica. It's a very young church. It's fighting for social credibility. He wants these Christians to have a good reputation with their neighbors, and lazy people who don't work very hard are just not the best ambassadors for Christ. I mean, that's fine if you're excited that Jesus is coming back. But you still got to do work in the meantime. You got to build your church. You got to serve the community. If you're just waiting for Jesus to show up and living off of other people, you got to rethink some things. Along these lines, let me close this morning by telling you about some of my favorite people. I actually thought of them while I was studying this passage this week. Their names are Don and Beth Nelson. Now, Don and Beth, by the way, there is a very young Matt and Michelle Herndon. Don and Beth were my host family while I was in seminary up in Bethel in St. Paul. So between 1999 and 2004, I would go up to St. Paul every 6 months and take classes for 2 weeks at a time. And in order to save money, I'd stay at the Nelsons' house. The Nelsons were the in-laws of an old youth group buddy of mine. Now, to be sure, you've never heard of the Nelsons. They are not on social media. They are not mired in controversy. They do not have a reality TV show. They're just a hardworking Christian couple living in Minnetonka. Don works in finance. Beth is a homemaker. Together they have raised 5 beautiful and godly children. They serve in their church. They go to Bible studies. They welcome visitors into their home, including homeless seminarians. Every morning when I was up at school, we would get up early. They would make me breakfast. They would bless me as I walked out the door in sub-zero temperatures. Don taught me how to drive in the snow. He helped me refill my antifreeze. He loaned me his car. He took me ice fishing, which, thank you, Nelsons, but I could have done without. Don and Beth are incredibly generous with their home, with their time, with their money, but they have worked hard to get there. In addition to supporting missionaries, they have posted on their refrigerator and pray for every day. They support a Christian summer camp where families can find rest and discipleship. Like I said, you won't hear about the Nelsons. They're too busy being Christians. They're too busy serving God, caring for their family, serving those in need. This is their ambition. This is all they want in life. Work hard, stay quiet, serve others, honor God. Honestly, my times with the Nelsons in Minnesota are some of my favorite in my life. Why? Because I was living in the presence of 2 humble, godly, generous believers doing it right. This is what Paul's getting at here. This is God's vision for your life. His ambition for you is not that you have a reality TV show or lots of followers on your social media accounts or overly complicated lives. You know how we can make our lives way too complicated. His ambition for you is something different. A simple life of hard work, prayer, and fellowship. His ambition for you is that you love each other more and more by working hard, minding your own business so that we can be generous and helpful to other people until they get on their feet. What does all this mean for you? You tell me. Maybe it means working a little harder, getting a second job so you're less dependent on other people. Maybe it means helping out more here at church so that you're more than a Christian consumer. Maybe it means thinking more constructively about how to really help the poor in your ministry. Maybe it means carrying your own weight at home so you're not such an underfunctioner. Maybe it means not being as much of an overfunctioner so that your spouse or your children have to learn to carry their own weight. Whatever it means for you. I know this can be a tough word, but God can help here. You see, we do not worship an angry, ultra-conservative God who wants to kick us off welfare. In fact, we are all highly dependent on the Lord. We depend on the Lord for His grace. We depend on His mercy. We depend on His provision. He has given us skills and tools and passions and resources to care for ourselves and care for each other. This is what it means to love. May we do so more and more.